Welcome back to the deep dive. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Today, we are transporting ourselves back to a very specific, and I mean very chaotic, moment in history, 1655 in the Caribbean.
hmm
But we aren't just looking at ships and cannons. We're unpacking a story that feels, well, incredibly modern.
It really does. I mean, on the surface, this is a standard military story.
Mm.
The English arrived to take the island of Jamaica from the Spanish.
Right.
But when you actually dig into the source material, into the letters and the economic records, you realize it's actually a story about data, networks, and what happens when a government collapses, but the operating system keeps running.
Right. And I think most people, if they know this history at all, they know the textbook version. English arrive, they fight the Spanish, plant the Union Jack, and boom, Jamaica becomes a jewel of the British Empire.
Simple conquest,
A nice, clean story.
which is the version that fits neatly on a timeline in a history class.
But the sources we are unpacking today paint a picture that is anything but clean. It's messy, it's chaotic, and frankly, it was almost a complete and total failure.
Oh, technically, the military operation was a catastrophe.
I was reading through the accounts of the invasion force led by Penn and Venables, which, by the way, sounds like a high-end law firm or something.
It really does. A bespoke tailor shop.
And it was just a disaster. They were poorly executed, totally undersupplied, decimated by disease. They didn't just march in and win. The Spanish resisted from the interior for years.
It was a quagmire. I mean, the English soldiers were dying of dysentery, they were starving, and they had no idea how to fight in that jungle terrain.
And yet, and this is the core puzzle we are solving today, despite that disastrous start, Jamaica transformed incredibly quickly.
That's the part that just doesn't add up on paper.
No, it went from a Spanish backwater to a functional, thriving English economic base almost overnight. So the question is, if the soldiers mess it up and the government was in chaos, who fixed it? Because the answer in the documents isn't more gunpowder, and it certainly wasn't English gold, because they didn't have any yet.
No. The answer, according to the research, is information. Specifically, the idea that the English conquered the physical land, the hardware, but they had to inherit the information network, the software, to actually make it work.
So we're going to explore this idea that Spanish Town, the capital at the time, wasn't just a dot on a map. It wasn't just a cluster of houses. It was a machine.
And a machine the English had no idea how to operate.
Exactly.
And to understand that machine, we have to look at what Spanish Town actually was before the English ruined the neighborhood, or as it was known then, Villa de la Vega.
Now, I have to be honest. When I read Spanish colonial capital in the Caribbean, my brain immediately goes to Hollywood. I'm picturing pirates' treasure chests.
Galleons loaded with silver bars stacked to the ceiling.
Yes, that's the image we all have, the famous Spanish silver train. And that's not wrong, right? That silver was moving through the Caribbean.
It was. But here's the twist.
So was Spanish Town the vault? Is that where they kept the loot?
Surprisingly, no. And this is a crucial distinction the sources make. Spanish Town wasn't a treasury. It didn't store the massive amounts of silver flowing from the Andes.
Really?
If you raided Spanish Town looking for a Scrooge McDuck vault of gold coins, you would have been very disappointed.
Okay, so if it wasn't a vault, what was its function? Why was it even there?
It was a filter. Think of it as the administrative nerve center. It processed the paperwork, the permissions, the provisioning, and all the intelligence for the empire.
So less of a warehouse for gold bars and more of a data processing center.
Exactly. It was all about bureaucracy. You have to remember, the Spanish imperial economy was massive and incredibly complex.
Right.
You had silver moving north, luxury goods moving south, ships moving east, orders coming from Madrid. Spanish Town was the hub that tracked the ships, logged the shortages, and managed all the delays.
That's a great distinction. A warehouse stores things. A processor manages information about things.
Precisely. And that is what the English found when they arrived. They found the buildings, sure. They found the physical structure of the town.
A hardware.
But buildings are useless without the software running inside them. They needed the data. They needed to know who owed who money, which routes were safe, what the price of sugar was in Amsterdam.
And data doesn't just float in the air, especially not in the 17th century. It lives in people. Which brings us to the human element of this story, which I found absolutely fascinating. Who was actually running this administrative machine in Spanish Town?
This is where we have to look at the specific demographics of the time. Living within this Spanish administrative environment was a small but extremely highly connected community of Sephardic Jews.
And their status there was
Complicated, right?
because legally, Jews were expelled from Spain way back in
It
1492.
was very complicated. Under Spanish rule, officially, they were new Christians, or conversos.
So they had to live outwardly as Catholics.
Yes, to avoid persecution by the Inquisition. They attended Mass, they baptized their children, but in private, many maintained their Jewish faith and identity.
But the sources mention a specific loophole regarding Jamaica. Something about the Columbus family actually owning the island. This part blew my mind.
Yes, this is a historical detail that changes everything. Jamaica wasn't a direct crown colony in the same way Mexico or Peru were. It was held under the proprietary authority of the Columbus family.
The descendants of Christopher Columbus.
Dukes of Veragua, yeah. And because of that specific legal status, the Columbus family retained the right to appoint certain officials. Crucially, the active enforcement of the Inquisition was much more limited there.
So the church didn't have the same unchecked power to just raid homes in Jamaica.
Exactly, not like they did in Lima or Cartagena.
So it created a sort of safe haven.
Relative tolerance is probably the better term. It wasn't absolute safety, you still had to be careful, but it was enough space for a community to establish itself. And because they were marginalized, because they were always looking over their shoulder, they built their own networks.
The internet of the 17th century.
That is not a bad analogy at all. These families had ties to Amsterdam, London, Curacao, Brazil, Barbados.
And let's remind the listener what communication was like. We're
Yeah.
talking about the age of sail here. You put a message on a boat and just hope it doesn't sink.
Or get captured by pirates or lost in a storm. Communication was incredibly slow and unreliable.
So how long for a message to get from, say, Jamaica to Madrid?
For the Spanish government, getting a reply could take 6 months to a year. But this Sephardic community had a trusted network. Their letters, their credit instruments, their market intelligence, it all traveled faster and more reliably than the official imperial mail.
Why? Was it just better ships? Or was it something else?
It was trust. If you're a Spanish official sending a letter, it goes through 10 layers of bureaucracy. It sits on a desk in Havana, then a desk in Seville.
But if you're a Sephardic merchant in Spanish Town, writing to your cousin in Amsterdam,
You have a direct line. You use codes. You use private couriers on merchant vessels you trust.
that is the key insight for me. In a world where news travels at the speed of wind, having a trusted contact in Amsterdam who writes to you in code, that's a strategic weapon.
It's the ultimate strategic asset. You know the price of goods before your competitors. You know which ships are delayed. You know the political climate in London before the governor does. That information arbitrage is where the real power lay.
So let's fast forward to 1655. The English invasion force, led by our friends Penn and Venables, crashes the party.
As we said, it's a mess.
They land, they're disorganized, everyone is getting sick. What happens to this network?
Well, the Spanish authority structure collapses immediately. The officials, the governor, the tax collectors, the military commanders, they flee inland.
Into the mountains, right, to organize a guerrilla resistance.
Right. The physical administrative structure just falls apart.
So typically in a war like this, you would think the information would vanish with them. They'd burn the papers, hide the ledgers, and run. That's standard operating procedure.
But that's the thing. The commercial knowledge didn't leave.
Why not?
Because the people holding it didn't leave. The Sephardic community stayed put.
Let's unpack that. Why did they stay? It seems incredibly risky. You have the English who are Protestants, the Spanish who are Catholics. It's a war zone. Why not run?
Well, we have a specific example that really illustrates this transition. There's a figure mentioned in the records named Campo Sabbatha.
Campo Sabbatha. That's a name that sounds like it belongs in a historical thriller.
He was a Sephardic Jew living in Jamaica, and the records show something incredible. He actually piloted the English fleet into Jamaican waters.
Wait, he guided the invaders in.
He did. This shows that the transfer of local knowledge was immediate. The English were navigating treacherous waters, literal reefs and shoals that could tear the bottom out of a ship.
And they were also navigating political waters.
And they had a guide who knew the coast intimately.
That is a powerful image. The Spanish officials are running for the hills, but the local pilot is literally steering the new management into the harbor.
And it wasn't just piloting ships. After the invasion, the Jewish community acted as intermediaries. They helped negotiate terms of surrender and transition
Negotiate terms for whom?
for themselves and for the Portuguese population, which, as we mentioned, was the code word for the Jewish community. They negotiated a way to remain under English protection while the official Spanish representatives were expelled.
Now, I can hear some listeners thinking, was this a betrayal? Was this a conspiracy? It sounds a bit like they opened the gates from the inside.
It's crucial to look at this through the lens of the time, not through modern nationalism. The source material emphasizes this wasn't a betrayal in the sense of betraying one's country.
It was what?
It was pragmatic survival.
Right. These are people who have been living under the threat of the Inquisition. They're used to regime changes. They're used to being the outside.
Exactly. They had no deep loyalty to the Spanish crown. Why would they? The crown had persecuted them for a century.
So they saw an opportunity.
And the English, led by Oliver Cromwell, were actually signaling a potential for better treatment. Cromwell was interested in readmitting Jews to England for economic reasons.
So the English offered a potential for better stability. And in exchange for that stability, the community offered what the English desperately needed.
Local data.
We know how the island works. You have the guns. We have the software. Let's make a deal.
Essentially, yes. And that deal is what allowed Jamaica to pivot so quickly. The English didn't have to rebuild the economy from scratch. They just plugged into the existing one.
Okay, so this brings us to the shift in power. The English take over. The flag changes.
And now we see a shift in geography, too. The sources talk about the move from Spanish Town to Port Royal.
Spanish Town remained the capital, right? Officially.
It remained the official administrative capital, the seat of government, where the governor lived. But the economic engine moved to the harbor.
To Port Royal.
To Port Royal.
The wickedest city on earth. We have to address the reputation. Pirates, booze, brothels.
Earthquakes. It had all of that. It was definitely a rough place. But if you look past the debauchery, the sources argue that accounting was the real engine of Port Royal.
Accounting. That's a hard pivot from wickedest city. I don't usually associate pirates with spreadsheets.
It sounds contradictory, but think about the economics of piracy, or privateering, to be polite. You have English privateers, legal pirates, sanctioned by the state, going out and seizing Spanish ships.
And they come back to Port Royal loaded with loot.
Exactly. Chests of gold and silver. But here's the problem. They're bringing back Spanish silver coins, pieces of 8, silver plate, religious icons. This is loot.
You can't just walk into a shop in London and buy groceries with a sack of varied Spanish bullion.
It's heavy, it's risky to transport, and its value varies. It's like trying to spend a bag of mixed foreign currency and gold jewelry at a local supermarket today.
You have value, but you can't circulate it.
Exactly. You need an exchange mechanism. You need to wash the money, or rather, convert it. And who had the skills and the network to be that mechanism?
The Sephardic merchants.
They became the converters. They could assess the value of the silver, assaying it to check its purity. But more importantly, they could turn that heavy physical loot into bills of exchange.
Okay, bills of exchange. We see this term in history books all the time. Can you just unpack that for us? What is it in 1655?
Think of it as a primitive wire transfer, or a traveler's check.
Okay.
Instead of shipping a heavy chest of silver to London, which might sink or get stolen, you deposit the silver with a merchant in Port Royal. He gives you a piece of paper that says, essentially, my partner in London will pay you £100.
So I carry the paper to London, walk into the partner's office, and get my money. Safe, lightweight, easy.
Correct. But here's the catch. For that piece of paper to be worth anything, the guy in London has to trust the guy in Port Royal. They need a pre-existing relationship.
Trust. It all comes back to that network again.
Exactly. A bill of exchange is only as good as the name signed on it. Because of those Atlantic networks we talked about, cousins, uncles, long-term partners, a signature from a Jewish merchant in Port Royal was good in Amsterdam, London, or Bordeaux. They transformed plunder into capital.
That is a huge shift. We usually think of pirates as just spending their gold on rum. But for the empire to benefit, that gold had to turn into usable finance.
To build ships and pay armies. And that required these intermediaries. There's actually a specific figure mentioned who really embodies this reach, Simon de Caceres.
Yes, Simon de Caceres. The sources say he wasn't just operating in Jamaica. He was providing reports directly to Oliver Cromwell in London.
To the Lord Protector himself, this wasn't low-level trading. De Caceres provided economic intelligence and geographic assessments regarding the Western design, the whole grand plan to attack the Spanish Caribbean.
So before the ships even sailed, before Penn and Venables even messed up the landing,
The intelligence network was already feeding data to the English leadership.
which reinforces the main thesis here. The conquest relied on inherited knowledge just as much as it relied on soldiers, maybe even more so.
They knew where to go because they were being told where the weak points were.
It's fascinating because later on, the sources mention that English competitors started complaining about this.
Right. By the 1670s, you see petitions from English merchants in Port Royal complaining that Jewish traders were dominating the exchange markets and shipping finance.
Which is basically them admitting, these guys are doing it better than us.
It's unintentional proof that the system was working efficiently. The competitors were annoyed because the Sephardic network was faster, more reliable, and better connected. They couldn't compete with the software.
I want to pivot slightly to the physical side of things. The source material spends some time describing the architecture of Spanish Town, the buildings themselves.
It does, and it connects the architecture to this theme of information and secrecy.
Paint the picture for us. If I'm walking down a street in Spanish Town in 1660, what am I seeing?
Well, it was standard Spanish colonial design, inward-facing buildings. You present a blank wall to the street, maybe a heavy wooden door, and everything opens up into a private courtyard in the center.
Very different from the English style of having a front lawn and big windows facing the road to show off your wealth.
Very different. Now, originally, this was just how the Spanish built things. It keeps the house cool, blocks the dust. But in the context of Jamaica, the sources argue it became a functional advantage for this community.
How so?
It allowed for a complete separation of public and private life. On the outside, you have the visible authority, the street, the government, the English soldiers patrolling.
But inside the courtyard, you have privacy.
Privacy for what? Religious practice, for one. Remember, habits die hard. These families had maintained a Jewish identity in secret for generations. But also privacy for commerce, storing high-value goods, conducting sensitive meetings.
So the architecture physically reinforced this distinction between the visible government power and the invisible economic power.
Precisely. The English controlled the streets, the public space. But the network controlled the courtyards, the private processing power.
That is such a cool way to look at buildings, not just as shelter, but as tools for social survival. It's like encryption for your house.
It reflects the whole situation. The English held the shell of the island, but the inner workings, the courtyard, if you will, was where the real continuity lay.
So let's zoom out. We've covered the failed invasion, the software of Spanish Town, the bill of exchange system. If we have to summarize the method that survived the transition from Spain to England, what is it?
I would list 3 key skills that survived. First, pricing risk in a volatile environment, knowing exactly how much to charge for insurance or shipping when there is a war on.
Which is a skill you only get by living through wars.
Exactly. Second, moving value across oceans without physical coin. That is the bills of exchange and credit networks, teleporting money effectively.
And third,
Operating across borders during perpetual war. These networks function regardless of whether England and Spain were fighting.
which they almost always were.
Right. The method was about being transnational in a world of rigid borders. While the English and Spanish were shooting at each other, this network was still moving information and value between them.
It really challenges the way we usually think about history.
Yeah.
We look at maps. We see a blue territory turn red because of a war. We think, okay, the owner changed. Everything changed.
But the deep dive here shows that the owner is the least interesting part. The English didn't just seize an island. They inherited a machine.
A machine they didn't know how to build themselves.
You couldn't operate without help. Spanish Town wasn't a vault where you go to get money. It was a place where information accumulated. And that information was durable. It survived the cannon fire. It survived the change in flags.
There's a quote from the source that I love. Money moves fast. Information moves faster.
That is the big takeaway. The enduring legacy of the conquest wasn't the silver they captured. That was spent and gone in a few years. The legacy was the method of managing the Caribbean economy. That system became the foundation of the British Empire's success in the region for the next 100 years.
It's the ultimate proof that knowledge is power. The English had the hard power, the ships and guns, but the network had the soft power, the data and the connections.
And you need both to build an empire. The gun gets you in the door, but the ledger keeps the lights on.
So here's a thought to leave our listeners with today. We've been talking about 1655. But if we look at the world today, we see governments rising and falling, we see borders shifting, we see corporate takeovers where the logo changes but the staff remains.
Does flags still change?
The flags still change. But what if we stopped looking at the flags and started looking for the software? If a major global system collapsed today, or if a superpower stumbled, who are the Sephardic intermediaries of the 21st century?
That is a provocative question.
Which information networks are currently acting as that invisible layer? Is it the SWIFT banking system? Is it decentralized crypto networks? Is it the fiber optic cables themselves? Who keeps the system running while the politicians argue over who owns the building?
It makes you wonder if the people we think are in charge are really just the ones patrolling the streets, while the real decisions are happening in the courtyards of data that we can't see from the road.
Something to think about next time you check the news. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.